I remember the taste of copper when the world went white and hot and very far away at the same time. The first impact takes my breath like a tithe, neat and impersonal, a splinter round that worms past ceramite and finds lung as if guided by an augur of malice. The second walks my spine like a pilgrim on broken steps. I try to voice the litany of endurance, and only wet bubbles answer the vox. Smoke folds the sky into a low ceiling, and grit taps my lenses like rain that has forgotten how to be water. Somewhere to my left, a brother roars a prayer, and to my right another voice cuts out mid-syllable like a sensor snapped shut. The ground tilts because I am falling, and then it tilts again because the planet itself shudders under macro-cannon argument. I taste incense tangled with propellant and my own iron tang, old church against new blood. I tell my legs to stand, and they negotiate with the void instead. My gauntlet closes on churned mud and a streamer of my chapter's colors, half buried and wholly stubborn. I press the cloth to my chest and feel the stitches of oaths like old scars waking. The vox crackles with the chaplain's cadence, a metronome made of thunderheads and iron. "Hold," he says, and the syllable nails itself into me. Hands become clamps, and the world narrows to a black skull helm, lenses bright with sanctioned sorrow and reflection of my cracked visor. The reclusiarch speaks my name as if it were a relic and not a bleeding thing. "You will not die," he says, and the statement is a bridge thrown over a chasm that still widens. The apothecary's narthecium sings its many-toothed hymn, and the bite of it is a white starburst mapped across my ribs. I feel the little miracles go to work, coagulants like prayers in liquid form, stims like bells rung in marrow halls, pain locks clicking shut like reliquary latches. I try to say that the Emperor can have me, and let the rest of this body lie, but the vox swallows the thought, and returns only static that tastes of coins. Above the smoke I glimpse banners taking the wind like wings that remember flying. Below the smoke, the enemy swarms in colors that have never seen absolution. Bolter reports stitch the horizon into uneven cloth, and autocannon fire rips it again. I am lifted on a litter of adamant and arms and vows. I watch my own blood track the edge of my pauldron as if it were studying scripture. The world begins to slide backwards as brothers carry me through the bones of a manufactorum that our shells have turned into open ribs. Soot falls in slow, seasonless snow, and servo sparks flit like nervous saints. I try to catalogue everything because cataloguing is a ritual that keeps panic outside the chapel doors. A broken cog-tooth altar, its sacred oils baked into a crust the color of old promises. A mural of the Primarch, his face scored by shrapnel so that his calm looks like a snarl and his eyes look like storms deciding where to land. A child's ribbon pinned to a bulkhead, impossible and therefore real, its blue faded to monastery silence. The litter jars as a shell lands too near, and my vision whites out into a corridor that ends in a point, and then widens again like a lung remembering its craft. A brother jogs beside me and lays a hand on my vambrace, and for a moment the world is only the pressure of that gauntlet and the unspoken treaty that it represents. The apothecary speaks in a voice made of steel filings and reassurance. "Vitals captured," he says. "Gene seed secured," he says. "Obligation continuing," he says. I nod, because nodding is a kind of obedience. And obedience is easier than choosing. We pass beneath a shattered arch where stained glass still clings in sharp sermons. Light from burning hab blocks shines through the fragments and paints my armor with saints that have lost their feet and swords that have lost their hands. In that borrowed color, I see myself as I might have been if the bolt had flown a finger's width aside, another figure in the glass, another lesson about zeal and breakage. The taste of copper swells when I cough beneath the rebreather, and I swallow it because there are few luxuries and fewer excuses. The chaplain recites the catalogues of names, those who have fallen in hours that have lasted entire years, and the vox carries each one like a candle across a dark nave. I add them to the ledger I keep behind my eyes, neat lines in a book bound in duty and salt. The litter enters the shadow of our bastion, and the hum of void shields changes the air into something that vibrates in my teeth. A squad peels away to rejoin the line, and another grips the handles to bear me deeper, and I feel a guilt that has its own weight, and a gratitude that has its own mercy. A tech marine waits in the mouth of the apothecarian, red as an incision and still as a verdict. Incense smolders in braziers made from repurposed shell casings, and the smoke climbs in disciplined columns that do not forget to waver. Servo skulls pivot to watch me pass, and their lenses flicker benediction and inventory in equal measure. The apothecarian smells of antiseptic, promethium ghosts, repair oil, and the faint sweet note of sanctified alcohol that tries and fails to make a home in this place. I am slid onto a slab that welcomes like a tomb and resists like a gurney. The lights above are a constellation of clinical stars, and each one has a different prayer carved into its casing, because the tech marines believe in redundancy the way drowning men believe in ropes. "Brother," the apothecary says, and his hand hovers over my gorget as if blessing and measuring could share a gesture. "You did not run," he says, and a small part of me stands up straight because medals are cold, but this is warm. I tell him there was nowhere to run that was not toward the enemy or toward our dead, and he makes a sound that could be agreement and could be grief, practicing to be silent. Pain roars up in a wave that is both animal and architectural, and then sinks again under chemical stone. I watch them work with the fascination of a man reading his own eulogy while deciding where to place commas. They harvest what must be harvested, because we are a garden and a foundry and a liturgy of parts that must continue. They seal what can be sealed, and mark what cannot with inks that inform the future how to carry the past. The chaplain places his crozier against my brow, and the tingle of it is a small thunderstorm that remembers my first vows. He speaks of duty as if it has corners where a tired man can rest. He speaks of sacrifice as if it is a door that opened to the same room you left, but cleaner. He speaks of honor as if it has teeth, and I believe him because it does. Somewhere a siren winds up into that pitch, which means the enemy has decided to argue with artillery again. The bastion answers in a voice that shakes the dust from rafters and makes the door icons blink in annoyed rhythm. In the corner of the apothecarian, a reclusium servitor turns pages for a battered lectern, its one organic eye blinking at syllables it can no longer taste. The codicier stands by the threshold, and his presence presses the air like a hand on a drum. He does not look at me, but I feel him listening for something that is not the heartbeat on the auspex. Perhaps he is listening for whether I wish to go. Perhaps he is listening for whether the chapter will allow me to go. The tech marine keys a panel, and a shutter slides back on a neighboring bay, and I see the sarcophagus that waits for someone who has run out of ordinary ways to be useful. It is a coffin shaped like a cathedral's idea of a man. It is a cradle shaped like a weapon's idea of mercy. Its face is a mask of patient iron, and its flanks are an archive of victories that belonged to other names before me. I do not know if it is meant for me, or for a future that has not yet chosen who to devour. The thought enters me like cold water and does not leave. The apothecary asks me to speak my lineage, and I do so in a voice that wanders but finds its road. I say my gene sire's name and feel my chest hitch as if a hand has reached through history to steady me. I recite the oaths I made when my hair was still all mine and my stride still believed in forever. I taste copper again because a laugh tries to escape and tears beat it to the door. The chaplain does not pretend not to see. He taps a rune on his vambrace that calls the cantors in the next chamber to lift the hymn a fraction and give me room to breathe behind it. Medici drones trace pale lines on my vision, and the Tech Marine's mechadendrites move in a choreography that turns violence into stitching. He murmurs in Binhurik to the machines that keep my heart from insisting on an exit. I have never learned that language, and yet I understand that he is reminding them who we serve and why refusal is heresy. On a secondary screen, a pict feed shows the line outside, brothers like dark statues moving through flame as if through weather. I count them because counting is proof. I watch a banner lift out of smoke like dawn that has decided to come anyway. I tell myself I will be there again in moments because hope knows how to lie with a straight face when it is serving a higher truth. The codicea steps closer, and his eyes reflect the monitor light so that he looks made of stars that have opinions. He says my name not aloud, and in the silence my bones answer. He shows me a memory that is mine, and was cutting itself dull by being repeated, and he sharpens it without pity. It is my first kill. It is my first prayer said over a sleeping enemy that would never learn why we had to be the ones to wake him. He places the memory back into me, as if returning a blade across a palm. I nod, because the ritual requires witnesses, and I am a participant and a witness and an exhibit at once. The Tech Marine asks for consent, and all the saints in me laugh, and all the soldiers in me sign. I mark the slate with a thumbprint that leaves more red than intended. The chaplain remarks that consent given under oath is more binding than consent given under comfort, and I agree because there is no room left to disagree. The sarcophagus across the way hums the way a creature hums when it dreams of running. In the corridor outside, the thunder of boots sketches a map of urgency on the stone, and I know the lines of that map better than I know the lines on my palm. The apothecary leans close and tells me a simple truth that will not fit anywhere but here. He says we keep each other alive in pieces, and that is still called keeping. He says the flesh is a good servant and a poor master, and that some masters must learn to live as servants if we are to have a tomorrow that looks anything like a today. I close my eyes because the lights have turned into honest knives. I open them because the reclusiarch's voice is a rope, and I am still learning how not to drown. He begins the catechism of continuance, and I answer between breaths that are more machinery now than wind. With every response, another strap cinches, and another cable finds a home, and another censor writes my story down in a dialect of numbers. I do not ask for release because the word would break my teeth and disappoint my dead. I do not ask for rest because rest is a door that sometimes forgets to open again. I ask to serve, and the room answers with the small approval noises of well-behaved engines. My vision narrows to the chaplain's skull mask, and the reflection of me inside it, a soldier hollowed by duty, and filled again with the same. He touches my brow with the crozier, and a spark leaps, and for an instant I smell the chapel where I took my vows, and the paint on the frescoes, and the salt on the air that had wandered in from a sea I have not seen since. The Tech Marine signals, and a cradle moves on tracks, and the rails sing a note that sounds like surrender, spelling itself as obedience. The taste of copper swells and breaks, and I breathe around it and through it and into it like a pilgrim walking into a relic's shadow and finding that it cools the fever without curing the fire. The bastion shakes again, and dust descends in lazy benedictions, and a bell somewhere chooses to be brave and rings. I think of the neophytes with their awkward zeal, and the veterans with their polished silences, and the way we all stand shoulder to shoulder like teeth in a clenched jaw. I think of the standard in my fist in the mud, and the feel of its stitching against my palm, and the way cloth can teach steel how to keep standing. I think of the possibility waiting in the iron cradle with its patient hum and its memory like a library that bites. I keep breathing because I have been ordered to keep breathing, and because orders and breath are the same thing said in different alphabets. I watch the ceiling lights slide past as they wheel me toward the rail, and the hymn rises to meet me like a road learned by heart. I keep my eyes open because there is more to count and more to witness and more to carry, even as others carry me. I taste copper and incense, and the mineral sweetness of coolant, and the thin, bright strand of terror braided tight with purpose, and I do not spit any of it out. I hold it on my tongue like a wafer made of blood and metal and vow, and I let it dissolve into me one grain at a time. I feel the shadow of the sarcophagus fall across my faceplate like an eclipse that has learned manners. I do not look away because this is still my duty and still my name and still my breath, even if borrowed. I listen to the chaplain's cadence and the tech marine's binharik and the apothecary's measured promises and the distant argument of guns, and I answer all of them with the same word that has carried me from whelp to this bright brink. Present. They call it a sarcophagus, and the word feels like a prayer trying to disguise a blade. I study the iron face that will become my face, and it does not blink. Its cheek is a vent, and its mouth is a grill, and its brow is a reliquary of brittle victories. Candles gutter along the rails, and their light crawls in brass like small obedient fires. Incense coils around mechadendrites and turns the air to syrup that tastes of cloves and sanctified oil. The tech marine speaks to the machine spirit in binharik that rattles like chains politely asking to be heavier. I do not know the grammar of it, but I know the meaning, because every syllable smells like obedience hammered flat. He offers unguents and checksum prayers, and the spirit inside the coffin replies with a pause that is also a test. The reclusiarch stands at my shoulder like a shadow that made an oath. His skull helm is a moon that does not wane, and his rosarius ticks with captive lightning. He tells me this is not an end, but a translation written in adamantine. I try to imagine myself as a language that metal can pronounce, and the thought shivers and holds. Medicae lines disappear into my skin with the patience of roots seeking stone. Pain harps are tuned along my nerves, and every string hums a key I will have to learn by heart. A cold gel climbs my spine and writes its signature in frostbite script. I feel lightness where bone used to insist, and heaviness where vows are about to live. The machine spirit listens, and I listen back, and the space between us is a chapel that keeps expanding. Diagnostics ripple across picked screens like fish made of numbers. Blood oxygen sings in green. Organ compliance mutters in amber. The question of consent flashes in white and waits like a door that is polite but cannot be patient forever. I mark my will again because repetition is how you keep a soul nailed to its shape. The tech marine acknowledges with a nod as small as a trigger squeeze. Mechadendrites descend with the gravity of spiders that have learned scripture. They calibrate ports cut by clean knives and logic. They thread the first of the iron nerves into me, and the world becomes a tuning fork struck by a distant hand. Every new cable adds a syllable to a name I thought I already owned. They slide me toward the open coffin, and its interior is a cradle of straps and ports and teeth that do not bite unless invited. I smell machine breath rising from the cavity like warm altar air. The interior runes pulse in heartbeat sympathy that is not mine yet, and will be. I lower into it like a relic returning to its box after a procession that forgot to end. The backplate kisses my spine with magnet and meaning. The collar closes, and the sound is a verdict passed without malice. The lid does not fall so much as Ariv. Gaskets compress, and the world is given to me through seams and lenses and wire song. Darkness takes the edges first, and then the middle, and then everything except the places where the new senses begin to bloom like cautious flowers. I feel my pulse not in my chest, but in the rails under the sarcophagus. I feel the room's temperature like a map written on my outer hull. I feel the vibration of prayer spoken 2 corridors away, and I know which floor tile the speaker stands on. The tech marine intones the litany of coupling, and the machine spirit opens one eye. It is not a human eye, it is a harbor light seen through rain that remembers being ash. It peers through me, and past me, and at me, in the same breath. It is old in the way mountains are old, and hungry in the way empty rooms are hungry. I greet it as a brother greeted on a field where both of us have already bled. It huffs through the coolant lines like a beast tasting the air for the shape of my fear. I do not pretend I have none. I offer it mine the way you offer a blade a whetstone. It accepts the offering and lays a calm hand across my throat made of nothing but current and agreement. The first handshake protocol engages, and the sensation is a bridge of copper crossing a river of breath. My mind stretches and a relay clicks, and the world grows a second spine. Phantom limbs wake before the iron ones, and for a moment I have hands that are memories, and hands that weigh half a cathedral. The memory hands try to flex, and the iron hands promise they will learn. A training lumen flickers in my vision, and the tech marine's voice threads into the sarcophagus like a measured wire. He tells me to breathe with the pump. He tells me to blink with the shutters. He tells me to move nothing and feel everything. I obey because obedience is a road with fewer cliffs. The sarcophagus inhales through its vents, and I borrow the rhythm, and my lungs stop trying to be the only musicians in the room. Cooling fluid migrates, and with it goes a kind of thought that used to belong to heartbeat alone. I sense pressure, thermal load, aperture width, gyro drift, core sanctity, spirit humor, seal integrity, and the quiet pride of freshly anointed bolts. The Reclusiarch's crozier taps the outer plate, and the vibration arrives in my bones with the same clarity as a spoken word. He recites the Charter of Enclosure and grants my name permission to exist in a smaller space without being less. I answer with a chime that I do not consciously choose, and the machine spirit approves with a shift that feels like a cathedra creaking beneath a weight it wants. Calibration begins, and time changes shape. The tech marine maps pain from red to data. He squeezes signals until they become volumes I can adjust. He threads thresholds through me like laces through a boot that will never come off. He pinches one lead, and my left shin insists it is on fire, even though my left shin has become a memory with an opinion. He releases, and the phantom flame reduces to a technical note that waits to be filed. He taps another lead, and a fist the size of a sarcophagus dreams of closing. He marks the dream as acceptable force, and draws a rune beside it with a stylus dipped in oil that smells of old engines and ceremonies. The machine spirit tests me while pretending not to. It shifts coolant flow without warning to see if I notice. It adds a tremor to a sensor and asks whether I will call it a lie. I notice. I call it a lie. It eases, satisfied that I do not worship everything presented as truth. Lighters of sanctified lubricant glide through arteries that have never known blood, and the rush is almost joy. I feel drag in a bearing that no one else can hear, and I whisper the complaint, and the nearest servitor peels away from its task to address it, because synergy is just another name for faith, practiced with tools. The Reclusiarch speaks low to the Tech Marine about precedents and temperaments and threshold histories. He says, I am stubborn in useful ways, and that my ledger is long and neat. He says I listen when told to listen, and strike when told to strike, and sometimes strike even when no one has told me, because some orders are older than voice. The Tech Marine answers in a choir of metallic clicks, and the machine spirit provides the amen by not hissing. Gantry arms embrace the external frame that will one day be my stride. Harness points mate with hard points. Mag clamps kiss into place like seals on letters that know their destinations. The first motion test is not motion, it is permission. The armatures ask if they may lift my weight, and I consent, and they do. And the world moves while I remain, and then I move while the world remains and both truths fit. Shock absorbers breathe. Gyros hum a hymn arranged for circles alone. A tremor passes down the spine of the coffin, and my mind follows it like a scout mapping a familiar valley from a new hill. A warning rune blossoms yellow and dies. A second blossoms green and lives. The Tech Marine notes the flowers and trims the garden with quick adjustments that feel like small, efficient kindnesses. I am shown my new field of vision, and it is a city with fewer alleys and more towers. It is narrower and it is deeper. It is framed by armor that will not yield and dotted with indexes that will not lie unless I tell them to. I practice looking left by aligning a cursor with a bead of candle wax that clings to a rail like a survivor. I practice looking right by tagging a chaplain seal stamped into a rivet head like a smile drawn with a gauntlet. A servo skull approaches with a wafer marked with cog and aquila and touches it to the sarcophagus mouth grill. I cannot taste it, but I feel the sacrament as an elegance in the current. I do not laugh because there is no breath to waste, but something shaped like gratitude arranges itself and stays arranged. The codicier returns and lingers at the threshold, and his presence makes the auspex mutter about mass that is also a concept. He lays 2 fingers on the lid, and his thought reaches through the metal with a gentleness that has survived long wars. He asks if I am still I, and the question is a needle that mends rather than punctures. I answer with the memory of a midday sun on a training square, and the taste of tin in a cut lip, and the sound of my name being shouted from wall to wall because I had scored a hit I should not have scored. He nods because truth is often a collage. He drifts away because he trusts the collage to hold its shape in the new frame. The Tech Marine introduces subroutines one after another, like novices being presented to an abbot. Stability mediator, impulse damper, fire control preconscious, load anticipation, analytics of threat and grace. Each bows and takes its place along a pew of code and waits for the hymn cue. I roll my attention along them, and they hum back like throats clearing before song. The machine spirit offers a memory with no pictures. It is a weight remembered by metal. It is a pace measured in craters. It is a brother I have not met, who once stood where I lie now, and left heat in the circuits, and refusal in the bolts. I place my memory of standing in rain as a mortal beside it, and the 2 memories recognize each other and agree to share a cloak. The Tech Marine opens a panel I cannot see, and somewhere in the coffin a valve turns, and the scent of ozone writes its signature across my tongue that is not a tongue. The core spins a little faster, and the hum becomes a note I would kneel to if my knees still mattered. I am a chamber instrument that has been tuned to a cathedral. I am a bell whose rope now runs through a dozen hands and one will. I am large in ways that do not feel like bigness, because all the edges are purpose. The reclusiarch leans close, and his voice drops until it is a secret that knows it will be shouted later. He tells me the sarcophagus keeps memory, like a miser keeps coins, and like a saint keeps scars. He tells me it will return mine to me when I need them, and hide them from me when I would drown in them. He tells me to trust the hiding as much as the giving. I do because I must, and because there is something immensely human in the way the iron pretends not to tremble when it takes my weight. A tone sounds that means the first phase is complete, and a second tone answers that means the second phase has begun pretending it was always there. Medici servitors adjust drips, and the fluid cools, and my thoughts stack more neatly. The tech marine asks me to flex the fist that is not attached yet. And I do. And he reads the ghost and smiles with half his face, while the other half remains property of the forge. He says the signal is strong, and that strength is a virtue when partnered with restraint, and a sin when married to the wrong orders. I accept the admonition as an old friend in a new uniform. He asks me to open the hand, and I open it, and he watches numbers arrange themselves like monks taking seats at prayer. He is pleased again because symmetry is a minor sacrament. And he is devout in small ways that keep large machines honest. They cycle the lid pressure, and every seal answers with a clean syllable that tastes of fresh wax and vigilant steel. They test the emergency uncouple, and the sarcophagus pretends to resist, and then yields in stages, and then is forgiven and resealed and praised for its suspicion. They flood the core with warmth that is not heat and light that is not sight. And I feel both as reassurance sent by a cautious God who knows my name at least twice. The machine spirit opens its second eye, and the room gets quieter without making less noise. It is agreement wearing the mask of stillness. It is appetite that has learned a table manner. I align myself with it along a line that runs from vow to socket. We share the same horizon now, even if we do not yet share stride. The reclusiarch lifts his crozier, and all sound bends around the gesture, because authority is also a physics. He recites the clause that binds flesh to iron without devouring either. He says I am both and must remain both. He says I will be called venerable by voices that need a father, and I must be a father and a wall and a bell and a fist and a tomb that never forgets it was once a man. I answer with the only word that both spirits like. Acknowledged. The tech marine smiles again, though he tries not to, because he is supposed to be iron pretending to be a man pretending to be iron. He tells me my baseline has settled like sediment in clear water. He tells me we will add mass in stages. He tells me my first footfall will not be mine alone, and that is a comfort dressed as a warning, dressed as a promise. Censer smoke thickens as an acolyte stokes the bowl with shavings from a relic cog, and the air grows sweet enough to recall the memory of a chapel floor cleaned by hands that believed scrubbing was a form of prayer. The machine spirit tastes the smoke through its filters and pronounces it acceptable and asks for more, and the acolyte obliges because even iron enjoys its rituals. Somewhere outside the bastion's shields, a shell falls short, and the ground telegraphs the news up through foundations and braces, and into my cradle and into my ribs, and I catalogue the waveform like a librarian learning a new enemy by its footnotes. The reclusiarch's vox clicks, and distant orders braid into neater lines, and I feel impatience approach like weather that has decided on a direction. The tech marine ignores impatience with the skill of a man who has married patience for centuries. He adds another library of code to my cortex, and its title is Balance Under Fire. It contains 1,000 pages, and every one is the same sentence written with different winds. I read the first page, and it reads me back, and we agree that falling is a choice until it isn't, and that recovery is a litany that begins before the slip. My old hands itch again, where the gel locks them into history, and my new hands answer from a place that is not hand, but intention translated into mass. I breathe with the pumps. I blink with the shutters. I listen to the rails sing. I let the machine spirit finish its second inspection of my fear and find it catalogued and shelved and accessible. I lie within the iron, and the iron lies around me, and the room steps back one pace without moving. The lid's interior lumen dims by one prayer's worth, and the hum settles into a note I could follow for miles. I keep following it. Rouse arrives like a hammer tapped against the inside of my skull until the echo agrees to be a bell. The command is a single syllable cast in vox iron and wrapped in benediction. It threads through coolant and oath and wakes gears that dream in circles. Shutters unhood my lenses and the world enters in disciplined slices. Status runes bloom, precise as saints engraved on coin edges. Core pressure settles into the green liturgy. Seal integrity answers with a choir of steady lights. A heartbeat that is not only mine counts time in piston strokes. The machine spirit opens its regard and shares it with me like a cloak. We are two witnesses in one reliquary, and the hinge is purpose. The cradle withdraws with the reluctant grace of a faithful servant stepping out of the way. Gantry arms bow and release. Mag clamps hiss amen. The floor receives me with the sound of a mountain choosing a stance. I feel the weight of myself as a set of promises measured in tons. I take the first step because the summons does not accept delay as a form of prayer. Juros wake and spin their quiet hymns. Shock absorbers whisper moderation to righteous momentum. Every motor hum tastes of sanctified copper and old victories distilled. My external auspex stretches like a hound testing new air. Threat logic populates the horizon with ghosts waiting to be promoted into targets. Friend runes anchor themselves in my sight like constellations that refuse to drift. Voxlink knits around my thoughts and binds them to brothers nearby and brothers far. The chaplain's cadence rides the channel as a spine rides a body. "Son of iron," he says, and the address settles deeper than armor. "Walk," he says, and I do. The bastion doors unseal and pour smoke and ash like incense that has given up restraint. Outside is a courtyard turned to an argument. Stone is fretted with crater hymns. Walls are blackened scriptures. Banners snap like teeth deciding to sing. The sky is a vault hammered by artillery until it rings its own bleak music. I taste propellant in the wind, and the wind answers with dust that knows the names of the dead already. I move toward the line, and the line shifts to make room, the way muscle makes room for old scars. Brothers turn their helms and tilt them in that small nod reserved for saints and engines, and the fortunate overlap between them. The machine spirit preens beneath their regard with a pride that pretends not to be pride. I lower into a stance learned by men and corrected by steel. Feet plant like foundations cultivated into fists. Servo jacks settle and lock. Bracing runes smile with austere satisfaction. Target prompts open like chapel doors during a storm. I let them and walk through. The enemy comes as a tide that has never read a map. Xenos chittering like broken lathes and wet knives. Traitor plate painted in lies that haven't been punished enough yet. War engines lumbering with the confidence of blasphemies that have not met sufficient counter-argument. My multi-melter warms with priestly patience. Within it coils a sun that will not apologize. Heat builds like a hymn, building a refrain. Calibration requests consent, and I grant it because refusal would be betrayal dressed as modesty. I speak the canticle of unmaking, and the barrel nods in understanding. A red rune climbs toward white grace. The reticle finds a heretic engine wearing a face stolen from courage. I exhale with the pumps and press the trigger that is a vow bent into a lever. Light steps out and writes a sentence that ends in liquefied guilt. Armor sloughs as if ashamed of itself. The engine howls like a cathedral roof torn free and then forgets how to be loud. The machine spirit purrs in a register only we share. Spent heat goes out through vents and the scent is metal translated into incense. Incoming alert bites my upper right pane. Autocannon tracers stitch a fast psalm toward my center line. I quarter-step, and the fire threads past in bright, disappointed lines. Impacts ring my left pauldron, and the rings settle as data instead of complaint. I lift the stormbolter built into my sarcophagus cheek. It coughs with helpful contempt. Sanctioned bolts swarm and find meat and heresy, and resolve both into quieter shapes. The Vox crowds with requests and declarations, and the occasional prayer that forgets it is being overheard. I trunk the noise into columns and give each a steward. Squad Tertius requests a breach, blessed and held. I mark the request with acceptance before the sentence finishes forming. A wounded brother bleeds out of a ruin like a small dawn with a limp. I pivot and step between him and the next incoming argument. Shells strike my hull like rude parishioners and fall repentant into fragments. I feel the scuffs as a history book taking notes. "Gratitude," the wounded brother gasps. "Expected," I answer, and the Vox clicks its approval. The enemy surges again, because stupidity and courage are cousins who share a surname. I give them the assault cannon, and it sings a hard, reliable song. Barrels spin prayer beads faster than speech can keep up. Spent casings cascade in brassy rain that chimes against my greaves. The recoil is a conversation with the earth about which of us is more stubborn. I win, but only because the earth is patient and allows the courtesy. The front ranks of the foe skein apart like cloth whose weft was neglect. I mark leaders and crush their permissions with directed attention. I mark stragglers and leave them to fear because fear is an ally when rationed. Left pane blinks with a new pall. A hulking silhouette stumps into view, its gait a limping sermon. Coffin to coffin. I know the smell of that hatred. A hell brute bells its pain and recognizes mine as kin. We are two altars dragged into the street and forced to debate with fists. Its power scourge whips the air into ugly braids. My power fist answers with knuckles that remember planets. We close because distance is a lie, cowards like. The first exchange is thunder struggling to be concise. Sparks shear away and try to be stars. The hellbrute laughs with a mouth full of nails. I drive my fist into a plate welded over its shame. The field blooms blue and turns blue into white and turns white into agreement. Metal collapses around the blow as if eager to be nearer the argument's center. It retaliates with the scourge and catches my right shoulder. Armor flares and dents and resists and reports 3 fault codes that amount to polite profanity. The machine spirit snarls and I snarl with it, and the snarl becomes a shared breath. The hellbrute lunges to grapple as if we might comfort each other by breaking. I anchor, heel biters biting stone, and let it come. We lock like vault doors kissing. Servos scream liturgies, motors chant their faithful bass. The vox around me fades because focus is a sacrament with a narrow temple. I pivot weight through hips that are now axles. The motion is an old lesson wearing new mass. I slam it sideways into a shattered pillar that remembers being important. Masonry explodes into gravel scripture. I pin its nearest arm under my knee, which is also a hammer. It jams a drill into my abdominal plates and tries to write doubt there. The bit skates and squeals and breaks its own courage. The assault cannon spools, and I rake its exposed rib work with private devotions. Cabling parts like rotten straw, fluid jets, and kisses my hull with boiling regret. It screams my secret name, and for a moment I hear the voice I used to use. Brother. It tries to say through a choir of absence. The machine spirit stiffens with old, exact fury. I tighten the fist and press it against the hell-brute's sarcophagus face. Be still. I tell him, because we both deserve a command that ends noise. I release the field. Light opens like a flower that hates gardens. When it closes, there is only slumping iron and a quiet that decides to work for us. I stand in the settling dust and catalog damage like a penitent counting beads. Shoulder integrity stable but offended. Abdominal plate scored and proud of its scratches. Right hip reporting warmth in a tone that suggests interest rather than alarm. All greens where greens should be, and a few ambers nodding as if they knew this would happen. The machine spirit mutters satisfaction and requests oil later, as if bribes make saints. Granted, I tell it, because partnership thrives on small promises kept. The line calls for a push. I answer by stepping forward until the ground accepts my argument as precedent. Brothers flow in my wake the way water explores a channel cut by a rock that refuses to budge. The enemy gives ground reluctantly because ground is heavy and difficult to carry. I fire in measured bursts that respect heat and disrespect heresy. Every trigger pull is a sentence in a language the foe learns by extinction. A missile arc sketches an insult toward my helm. Countermeasures flower and confuse the insult into missing etiquette. The warhead veers and embraces a statue that had already lost its head and therefore does not complain. The blast paints my hull in shrapnel freckles that will read as experience later. I step through the smoke and the smoke tries to cling like a child who has heard the word goodbye too often. I shed it with motion. Motion becomes doctrine again. I shoulder into a breach where the wall has decided to be a suggestion. Inside the ruin, the air is meat-thick and bright with particulate. Auspex cuts lines through the murk and names shapes with polite certainty. Close-range tags ignite like constellations tattooed onto knuckles. I find the largest congregation of defiance and join it with malice baptized in duty. The storm bolter chatters to one side while the assault cannon preaches on the other. My fist does the quieter work of editing. A screaming form leaps for my faceplate with a blade held like a conviction. I meet him with a gentle backhand that deconstructs his argument into components the apothecaries will not need. Another darts beneath and seeks joints as if curiosity were a weapon. I lift my foot and set it down where his certainty used to be. I pivot again, because pivot is survival masquerading as grace. In the upper panes, a pair of jump-pack traitors carve contrails through the haze. I lead them with contempt practiced to a shine, and soar one from the sky and make the other remember he has business elsewhere. The Vox brings me a voice that has spoken to me since I was young and full of foolish speed. "Brother Ancient," the captain says, and the title sits like a hand on my shoulder. "Anchor the left," he says, and the map in my mind reorders itself as if it had been waiting for that exact sentence. "Understood," I answer, and the word tastes like a brick placed in a gap. I turn until the bulwark becomes my spine again. I plant and become geography. Brothers pivot around me and their movements reap a rhythm that belongs to drill and faith. Shots stake the ground in rows that read as ownership. Chants roll like low weather. I hold. Volleys crash against me and leave their signatures stamped like visas in a passport. Heat climbs and sheds and climbs again. Coolant cycles like an ocean under ice that knows when to flex. Faltrons wink and vanish and reappear and sulk off. I feel a wobble in a knee actuator and adjust the algorithm with the calm of a scribe changing a letter to save a line. A neophyte stumbles into my shadow and steadies himself by bracing a palm against my greave. His breath stutters and his eyes are planets with weather. He looks up as if at a tower that has decided to be kind. "Hold the rosary tight," I tell him, and he does. And the tremor in his hand becomes something like rhythm. He nods and goes back to the work of becoming a story worth repeating. I track a new pressure in the street beyond the smoke. Heavy steps trying to be quiet. Treads trying to remember they were once gentle. A battle tank slides into view with the humility of a boulder rolling downhill. Its turret searches for a sentence it can finish. I present myself as punctuation. The multi-melter asks for patience, and I gift it patience, and the gift returns interest. I paint the target reticle across the tank's cheek where pride collects. I hold breath with the pumps until the moment is level. I press, and the sun leaves home again. Armor slumps like a confession. Fuel flowers in violent color. The turret tries to turn away from consequence and does not succeed. A cheer lifts on the vox, and I file it as morale gained and noise to be trimmed. I trim it because clarity is kindness during killing. The captain orders a measured advance, and the measured advance begins to exist. I pace it with strides that sound like decisions. Around me the company breathes and fights and bleeds, and becomes its own weather system. I catch a glimpse of the reclusiarch moving like a storm front, his crozier striking the ground in declarative statements. He looks up at me as we pass through each other's references and touches 2 fingers to his helm in acknowledgement that feels like a key turning in a lock. The machine spirit basks in that recognition, and I let it, because pride properly leashed pulls like a well-bred engine. We reach a square that has forgotten it was supposed to honor someone, and now honors entropy instead. I test the stone with a heel, and the stone answers with grudging approval. I take the center and give my brothers edges. Edges become blades. Blades become borders. Borders become a promise with teeth. The enemy gathers for another wave, because repetition is their only liturgy. I watch them mass and feel the ground's subtle complaint under their weight. I adjust stance by a span and an inch and a memory. The assault cannon idles like a choir clearing throats. The stormbolter ticks impatient syllables against my grill. The multi-melter sighs and waits for the next necessity. The machine spirit and I keep our breathing matched. The vox clicks once, twice, 3 times in the captain's pattern. We are ready. I let the crosshairs shrink until they are the size of certainty. I do not count down because the count has been running since the day I swore my first oath. I lean into the next second as if into a door that is about to open. Dormancy is not sleep, and I learn its edges by touching them from the inside. The world becomes a chapel pared down to rails and breath. The hum of the sarcophagus changes key until it finds a note that can hold years without spilling. I lie inside the box that is not a box, and the box lies inside the fortress that is not a grave. Time loosens its grip like a gauntlet, unbuckling one strap at a time. A minute develops a horizon, an hour grows furniture and shadows and steps that know their own echo. Days collect as residue on vents and as polish on prayers. The machine spirit settles its weight beside mine, like a beast that has learned it is kept, and still thinks it keeps me. We speak in small adjustments and in the manners of pressure and yield. It asks for oil with the dignity of saints who remember scarcity. I grant it with the ceremony of men who remember hunger. The bastion breathes and I breathe with it. Shields cycle, and the air quivers in my plates like distant thunder teaching patience. Sump pumps throb like hearts that learned the litanies before they learned the alphabet. Somewhere above, macro cannon are flensed and re-blessed, and the smell of solvent comes down in dreams that prefer daylight. I count because counting builds floors. I number the hairline cracks in the ceiling panel over my left lens. I catalogue the wax drips on the nearest rail and assign each a saint out of kindness. I memorize the sequence of clicks in the Techmarine's step so I can tell which apprentice he has sent before he speaks. I add their names to the ledger under a heading that reads, "Apprentices who will outlive me and therefore must learn quickly." Servo skulls drift like obedient moons in a gravity of duty. Their lenses flash a liturgy of inventory, and I answer with silence that does not disagree. Sometimes the reclusiarch visits and leans his helm against my hull, as if listening for waves in iron. He recites the names of the recently returned and the names of the recently refused. The first column is longer than the second, and the second is heavier than the first. I hold both, and neither falls. Neophytes come when their masters are brave enough to let them. They approach as if I might mistake them for the enemy and swat them into lessons. They stand beneath my shadow and practice the litany of protection with voices that crack like new crockery. I listen and keep their errors for later and keep their successes for always. Sometimes one reaches out and steadies himself with a hand on my greave. He expects cold and finds warmth hoarded by metal. He looks up at the lenses and tries to imagine eyes behind them and gets it half right. I tell him in the small voice the sarcophagus lets escape that fear is a leash when you hold it and a pit when you forget to. He nods and goes back to his drills, and the ledger makes room for a new page titled "One Who Will Surprise Us If Allowed." Between visits, the quiet grows its own species of noise. Coolant murmurs in culverts and finds tiny eddies that repeat on the hour. Bearing number 7 clicks once when the temperature drops below a devotion known only to it. Anointing oil threads into seams and hums a vowel the machine spirit pretends not to enjoy. I taste dust that carries the history of a week in the grit of one mote. I can tell who crossed the nave by the steel note their souls leave on the stone. Artificers carry a cord that debates. Chaplains carry a cord that concludes. Scouts carry a cord that waits in doorways. In the far vaults, the choir practices the penitent's measure until it becomes a staircase I climb without moving. On the 5th step of that staircase, a memory opens like a hatch, and I look through. I see a sunlit square where a training blade clacked against mine, and I remember how surprise tasted when it belonged to the other man. I hear laughter that was permission to be young for one more hour. I let the memory sit beside me and grow quiet enough to keep. The machine spirit watches the memory like a scribe watches a spark in a library. It approves because contained fire cooks. It disapproves because uncontained fire teaches. We compromise as old soldiers compromise when presented 2 correct answers and not enough time. Rites of preservation arrive in carts that squeak an octave higher than the day before. Acolytes with hands like careful birds open access plates and whisper hello, as if greeting a tired uncle. They paint unguents with brushes made from hair that once belonged to a hero with fewer scars. They tap seals with knuckles and listen for answers that live in tone. They log every response with the seriousness of surgeons and the pride of gardeners. The Tech Marine corrects their penmanship even when numbers are perfect. He reminds them that ugly writing offends machine spirits because ugliness is a kind of dishonesty. I laugh where no one can hear, and the machine spirit laughs where no one will admit. Dormancy becomes a classroom that never rings a bell. I practice stillness until I can hear the hinge of my own patience. I rehearse awakenings until the rouse command would find me half standing anyway. I run simulations in the dark, and the dark participates like a partner that knows the steps. In one rehearsal, I hold a breach against a tide of shapes that forget to be afraid. In another, I carry 2 wounded and a relic, and the relic feels heavier because it knows it is being watched. I measure how long I can wait before I must fire, and then I extend the measure by a breath, and then another breath, and then the length of a prayer bead. Waiting becomes a blade sharpened from both ends. The chaplain returns with a dent in his crozier from an argument he won. He drags a stool close and sits as if the ground had suggested it. He speaks of the dead without erasing them. He speaks of the living without excusing them. He speaks of the enemy without lending them romance. He rests his head against my plate and does not move for a count I keep without telling. When he rises, the dent seems smaller and his breath steadier. He thanks me, and I answer that I did nothing, and he says that nothing is a kind of shelter when done right. After he leaves, I inventory the dent again because it has become a landmark, and landmarks are mercy. Repairs sing in neighboring bays with the voices of tools that know exactly what they are. Riveters clatter like rain forced to tell the truth. Hammers speak the old language of negotiation with stubborn metals. Welders scribe light that smells of pennies and pennants. Every sound has a place, and the places form a map I could walk blind. I walk it often without moving and arrive every time. Sometimes the codicier visits and does not announce himself because minds announce themselves without ceremony. He places a palm on the lid and asks if the silence is treating me kindly. I tell him the silence has teeth and uses them carefully. He smiles where I cannot see and tells me he has taught silence to some men and found it refuses to learn. He leaves a thought folded 3 times and tucked under a latch. I open it when I am alone and find the memory of a starfield above a world we saved and a wind we did not. I sit with it until the machine spirit stops calling it inefficiency. Pilgrims come on sanctioned days and press their foreheads to the outer hull as if the iron could drink fear and return water. They leave offerings of spent casings and oath ribbons and small stones that fit a palm tightly. A child traces the aquila carved in my breast and mistakes the groove for a river on a map and sails a fingertip along it. Her guardian pulls her back and scolds, and I file the scold under human noises that pretend to be braver than they are. The child looks back, and I turn 1 lumen a degree brighter, and she believes she has been blessed, and the ledger writes a line without ink. The Bastion's chronometer fails during a storm of static that reads like a book being burned 1 letter at a time. For 3 days by my count, the bells ring at wrong hours, and prayers arrive late, and the kitchen serves night soup while the sun remains suggested. No one panics because panic is for people who think clocks are truth. The Tech Marine tames the chronometer with a chain of numbers that do not lie. The chain wraps the failure, and the failure decides to be a servant again. We all pretend we never noticed, and the pretending costs less than the truth. In the long hush between campaigns, I learn the weight of gratitude when it has no object. I thank the rails for not squealing when the acolytes are asleep. I thank the filters for catching the ash that would clog a lesser breath. I thank the machine spirit for sharing its dreams of weight and convey to it my dreams of rain on a training square, and we are both improved. When the wind shifts from the docks, I taste salt that has travelled in the folds of a sailor's coat. When the manufactorum purges a line, I taste copper and know a blade somewhere has been honest. When the reliquary opens for high feast, the air fills with old leather and older vows, and the machine spirit sits up straighter without admitting it. A plate on my right shoulder develops a hum that is not a fault but a habit. I let it hum because the note fits nowhere and everywhere. The acolytes hear it and whisper that I sing in my sleep, and their whisper becomes a rumor, and the rumor becomes a comfort that heals nothing and hurts no one. The rumor finds me, and I allow it the dignity of being partly true. In the still watches, the bastion door icons blink in slow conversation with no one. I learn their language enough to hear boredom, concern, petty triumph, and the gossip of hinges. One day a door refuses to open for a quarter minute as a lesson to an acolyte who kicked it. The acolyte apologizes to the door with flowers stolen from the cloister garden and a note that says, "I was wrong," and the door opens for years without another lecture. I record the incident because machines must be courted and men must be taught that courting machines is not submission, but stewardship. The librarius requests that I host a tome on my hull for a week while its cabinet is sanctified. They bolt the book in a cradle and the pages smell of iron and incense and marine wax. Neophytes are brought to read a single page and then write it from memory and then burn their paper and then keep the ash under their tongues during prayer. I do not understand every ritual, but I respect all of them because respecting the unknown is easier than explaining the ruined. The book leaves a mark that cannot be polished away, and I keep it because the scar speaks a language I enjoy rereading. A winter that belongs to another world passes across the fortress in shipments and routine. We receive crates of cold weather gear and salt for roads we do not have, and dried fish from a harbor where men sing. We do not need these things, and yet we store them because supply lines believe in hope more than plans do. The smell of the dried fish haunts the lower vaults for a month. The machine spirit hates it and claims the fans labor. I lie and tell it the fans sound heroic, and it forgives the fish for existing. On the 93rd night of that non-winter, a novice scribe sneaks into the nave and plays a hymn on a battered harmonium. He plays it badly and from memory and with more heart than training. The notes limp and take wrong turns and still find home one by one. The machine spirit softens around the edges until its hum fits the key. I count the tears the boy blinks back and pin them to the ledger under the brave things that no one will record if I do not. The apothecarian sends a servitor with a tray of gene seed vials to pass through the nave. The servitor's gait is sure, and its gaze is empty, and its burden is holy. I listen to the faint clink of glass against glass, and think of seas inside seeds, and wars inside seas, and oaths inside wars. I hold my breath measured in pumps until the tray has crossed the threshold and is safe from clumsiness that no one intends. The servitor nods to me because someone taught it courtesy. I nod back because someone taught me humility. A statue cracks down the left shin after a tremor that does not make the news report. The crack opens like a mouth and tells dust the story of gravity. The reclusiarch instructs the novices to leave the crack in place and to gold leaf its edge, so the wound is honest and beautiful. They do, and the statue becomes more true and less perfect, and the knave learns a better lesson. In the quiet, the machine spirit asks me if I fear waking to find nothing to kill. I tell it there will always be something to hold. It considers and agrees and oils a thought it had left to rust. A picked feeder fails, and then coughs up a stream of archived images that strobe the nave in pre-war sunlight. We all stand in that light like men caught telling the truth. The images wander through parades and drill and a brief scene of a cook burning soup and laughing anyway. The acolytes try to switch it off, and the tech marine tells them to wait, because memory is a maintenance cycle too. For 3 minutes, the fortress tastes like apples I never ate. The picked feeder blinks, steadies, and becomes dutiful again. I keep the apple's ghost behind my teeth, and the machine spirit keeps the laughter in a buffer it denies exists. At schedule marks, the reclusiarch places a hand upon my hull and prays for my dreams to remain readable. I want to tell him that clarity is costly but worthwhile. I want to tell him that some dreams arrived without names and left fingerprints anyway. I want to tell him that the machine spirit and I exchange watch in the night, like sentries who agree not to wake the camp. Instead, I let the hull warm under his palm until he takes warmth for an answer. A friendly quarrel erupts between two artificers about whether a cog tooth should be cut proud or flush. They bring the argument to my bay as if I were a judge carved from ordnance. They present exemplars and cite saints and footnote catastrophes. I angle a lumen toward the proud tooth and the flush tooth in alternating beats until both men laugh at themselves and agree to consult a third book and a fourth saint. They leave with better humor and worse certainty. And this is progress. When storms ride the city, the rain comes as hiss and taste, and await the roofs learn to negotiate. I count the beats between thunder and the chapel's echo. I measure how long it takes the gutters to find their stride. I mark the drip that always misses the barrel and becomes a small lake no one mops. On the 50th, such storm, an acolyte moves the barrel 1 handspan and solves a problem older than his parents. I promote him in the ledger to steward of the sensible and hope he never learns why such stewardship is rare. Sometimes the machine spirit asks for stories that are not battles. I tell it about the smell of gun grease warming on a morning when no one had yet shouted. I tell it about a brother's habit of humming the same 2 bars and never the third. I tell it about the color of a sky just before the drop, and how every cloud looked like a promise that might keep itself. It listens and pretends to be unmoved, and then adjusts the resonance in the left side vents to mimic wind through flags. I pretend not to notice, and then notice a long time. The librarian returns to test wards etched along my sarcophagus lip. He speaks sigils that taste like rain and iron and the sound of hooks in the sea. The wards ember and die, and ember again, and he nods that the locks still remember which doors not to open. He rests his knuckles on the plate and whispers that some doors open inward when forced. I store the warning where I keep the dangerous comforts. Resupply brings a crate of candles carved with the names of saints who died standing up. An acolyte leaves 3 on my rail with a note that says, "For your long nights." He does not know that my nights contain their own lanterns. I burn the candles anyway, by way of an engine seer who enjoys small rebellions, and we agree that the smoke tastes like crowded chapels and nervous faith. Under the floor, the rats of the city invent their own wars. I hear their skirmishes and their treaties and their funerals. I learn which duct is a kingdom and which crack is a pilgrimage, and which grain room is a miracle that will end in teeth. I respect their industry and wish them better gods. The bastion receives visitors of rank who speak in careful cadences about corridors I will never patrol. They touch my hull with gloves and murmur valor in approximate keys. I answer with silence that does not invite them to linger, and they leave flowers that wilt before the next watt. A single petal clings to a seam for an entire week, as if proving something about persistence. I salute the petal every hour, and the machine spirit calls me sentimental in Binharik, that forgets I understand tone. I let it win the point, and keep the petal's record anyway. The wall clock clicks, and stutters, and catches. and the acolytes learn to correct it with a breath blown at an angle. They call the breath a trick, and the tech marine calls it a calibration, and the chaplain calls it a parable. All three are right, and the clock keeps better time under the attention. On a morning measured by bells rather than sky, a company marches out, and the floor learns their names and teaches me. Boots print a ledger I cannot write, and do not wish to forget. They return smaller and louder, and their cadence scavenges new beats from silence. I make room for the missing in the ledger by not closing the page. The machine spirit asks if this practice is efficient, and I ask if dignity ever is. It concedes and offers me the absence as a co-signer. A scratch appears on my inner viewport where no tool should reach. It looks like a comet and behaves like a signature. I suspect the chaplain's signet ring and let the mystery remain for morale. In the depth of one night, a quake rolls through the foundations like a thought changing its mind. Statues shiver and chains whisper and dust chooses new altars. The sarcophagus flexes and returns to true, and the machine spirit grumbles old curses that sound like grandmother engines telling stories. The quake leaves a hairline in the far arch, and the hairline leaves an itch in the eye. We gild its edge the next day as we did before, and honesty remains policy. I am visited by a veteran who has forgotten more pains than most men will ever own. He places his hand against my hull and speaks quietly about a rookery on a far cliff where birds argued with wind and always won. He asks if I remember birds. I tell him I remember the angles they write over water and the suddenness of the turn that never spills a feather. He smiles and calls that enough to pass. He leaves smelling of wind that did not touch him, and I keep the smell as proof that stories alter physics. The machine spirit stores the bird angles in a pattern buffer to optimize turret slew and pretends this is not poetry. I grow aware of a small misalignment in the eastern transept door that adds a croak to its hymn. I ask an acolyte to plane the bottom edge, and he bows as if I have handed him a relic, and then stares at the door as if it were a dragon. He returns with a plane and a prayer, and shavings curl like pale blessings. The door sings again in the key we trained it to, and men smile without knowing why the world improved by a half tone. Before one set of bells, the captain steps into the nave with the walk of a man testing how much weight a memory can carry. He lays his gauntlet on my hull and says nothing for the count of 208. I keep the count because numbers matter when words refuse. He withdraws and his gauntlet leaves a clean imprint in soot that no one wipes away. Later, a neophyte traces that imprint and takes courage from the depth of it because courage is greedy for measures. Rain returns and leaves and returns, and a slip of sunlight finds a seam and writes a thin, bright line across my plates. The line travels as the day does, and I watch it make a pilgrimage from rivet to rivet. When it finally climbs off and onto stone, I feel a small absence like a page turned while I was still reading. The machine spirit does not comment because some graces come without metrics. I rehearse the first step again in stillness and map how many arguments begin with wait. I practice saying yes to the rouse that has not been spoken. I practice saying no to the doubts that ask for audience during quiet hours. I practice holding names on my tongue until they dissolve and become part of breath. The breath continues, and the rails hold, and the chapel hums, and the ledger fills, and the door hinges gossip, and the candles spend themselves with civility, and the machine spirit curls and uncurls like a patient thunderhead, and the long sleep keeps teaching in sentences that end without stopping. They roused me under a red moon that looked like a wound refusing to close. The vox carried the summons with a gravity that made bolts seem light. I woke into the taste of incense, scorched thin, and the aftertaste of steel kissing steel. The bastion doors peeled open, and the world pressed in with the impatience of a mob that had memorized our names. The courtyard had become a geometry of craters and hastily sanctified barricades. Every stone wore soot, as if doctrine had turned to ash and chosen a uniform. The banners tried to stand like spines, and the wind negotiated a truce with the smoke. I stepped from the cradle, and the deck accepted my weight with a grunt learned from mountains. The machine spirit stretched like an old warhound, hearing the word hunt doled out at last. I listened to the ground, and the ground told me there were too many feet, and some of them did not belong to men. The red moon painted dust into meat and meat into monuments. The enemy ringed us like a jaw that had chewed through better meals. Traitor plate gleamed with lies made lacquer. Daemon light fretted the edges of reality and wrote hooks into prayer. Siege engines came on in the rolling grammar of inevitability. Their treads spoke in devotions to entropy. Their guns preached sermons that replaced nouns with holes. I advanced to the breach where the wall had decided to be a suggestion. Rockcrete lay in hunks like broken commandments. Rebar poked from the rubble like ribs in search of a chest. The captain's voice arrived with the calm of a ledger before the ink. "Anchor," he said, and the single word sent the map in my head to its duties. I posted myself where collapse had chosen to begin its career. I became a door frame that refused doorhood. Brothers lined my flanks, and their helms turned just enough to tell me the prayer was shared. The enemy tried to pour through as if we were a funnel blessed by their gods. I gave them a different liturgy. The assault cannon warmed and spun until its song became an axis the world might borrow. Shells scissored the tide into shapes that learned humility one fragment at a time. The storm bolter coughed measured contempt and found faces under horns and faces under masks, and the empty where faces used to be. A howl rolled up from the outer streets and rattled the flayed banners on the enemy's masts. Things in borrowed flesh ran on all fours and remembered too late. They bounded the rubble like pilgrims who had lost the address. I set my stance and let the first meet the knuckles sanctified for such errands. Bone generalized into paste, and the paste learned silence. The second managed a swipe that left a crease on my cheek grill, like a signature I did not invite. The third tried to climb, and I introduced it to the roof in a way that simplified ambitions. Mortars began a patient punctuation over our heads. Each boom wrote a period somewhere too close to a prayer. Shrapnel fell like alphabet. The bastion sang back with its heavy guns, and each reply was an argument delivered with a steady hand. Dust learned new ways to become fog, and my auspex cut lanes through it with arithmetic. The Reclusiarch's crozier rang a conclusion against the stairs, and I felt the conclusion in my plates. He moved along the line, a weather front in a skull mask, tapping helms and spines and my hull with a rhythm that erased doubt. He stopped beside me and pressed his brow to my iron as if to hear the tide's plan. "Hold," he said, and the command arrived where my bones used to collect certainties. I answered by planting until the ground forgot other uses for itself. Through the breach the traitors advanced in disciplined blocks that remembered our drills and mocked them. Their officers waved blades welded from stolen oaths. Their banners displayed emblems that had once been arguments and were now appetites. I watched their spacing and their cadence and the flick of their muzzles when fear began to show up late. I waited until the moment emptied its lungs, and then I breathed into it with fire. The multi-melter opened, released, and closed like a gate to a star. A squad became a puddle, and the puddle began to teach steam how to confess. The return fire clattered and drilled and hissed and pleaded, and I listened to all of it as data. Hits rang a bell choir across my pauldrons. A Lescanon lanced my left flank and peeled paint and pride, and a sliver of cautions. Amber runes lit like concerned saints. The machine spirit flared its ruff, and I bled off heat with the steady discipline of a monk counting beads during a fire. Still they pressed, because pressing is what they have when love has gone elsewhere. A hellbrute lurched into the breach as if invited by old kinship. Its chain fist drooled spark, and its eyes were funerals that never dismissed. I greeted it as one greets a cousin sworn to the wrong king. We clashed in a language that prefers nouns like wait and verb phrases like crush now. The chain fist chewed at my shoulder and skipped and chewed again and found less satisfaction than it had hoped. My fist answered with the patience of sculpture. I drove the blow into a panel engraved with a saint's name backwards. The field bloomed and folded and left an opinion where rivets had once stood. It screamed and tried to hug, but our family never liked embraces, and the assault cannon explained this in detail. It staggered over a broken statue that might have been laughing. I seized its sarcophagus and whispered through vox that could still be kind. "Be still," I said, and then I made the instruction practical. Behind it, the tide spilled and balked and flowed around the fallen like water skirting a new cliff. Brothers stepped into the wake I made and wrote their parables in bolt and blade. A neophyte slipped on blood turned to varnish and sprawled. I moved a foot without moving the line and let him brace on grieve instead of fear. His breath hitched and reset. He rose and shot too high and shot again correctly, and the ledger drew a quiet check beside his name. The square beyond the breach became a foundry of decisions. Our devastators stitched light along the arc of a demon engine that wanted to bring its own sky. The librarian carved silence in the air, where screaming had begun to breed. The enemy forced a push with bodies, because bodies are cheap in their economy, and I met price with refusal. Impact after impact rang my hull until the ringing became a bass line to our hymn. I stepped forward into fire because sometimes walls are better a meter ahead. The machine spirit and I split attention like a coin cut into two full coins. My bulk held the center, and my guns translated apostasy into plausible shapes for graves. On our left, a breach began to widen as masonry remembered gravity with sudden enthusiasm. I angled, braced, and made myself a keystone where architecture had retired. Weight loaded into joints that had opinions. Rams screamed against the outer gate, and the gate screamed back with old iron stubbornness. The captain's orders arrived like clean water over heat. "Reserve to the third stair," he said. "Ancient, mark, and deny," he said. I marked and denied and marked again until the verbs became reflex, and the reflex became a place other men could stand. Traitor rockets traced sullen arcs, and I learned the handwriting of their launchers. I shifted rhythm and let two pass to teach them hope, and crushed the third to teach them arithmetic. A squad of jump-wrought murderers vaulted the breach with the eagerness of mistakes. They fell on us like punctuation in the wrong sentence. I timed the spin of the assault cannon to the beat of their packs. The first met a wall of rounds that unmade him mid-vow. The second got closer and scrawled a blade across my visor that squealed like a confession. I caught him with the back of my fist, and he learned the difference between speed and momentum. The third landed on my carapace and hammered at seams while his teeth preached. I rolled a shoulder and let his boots miss understanding. He tumbled down and discovered the storm bolter's short temper. The square filled with smoke, and straight lines lost their purpose. I relied on angles older than sight, and on the pull in the floor that tells the truth about where men are dying. The reclusiarch waded past, a tide-bound tower, his crozier slamming punctuation into the day. He touched my hull, and some of the ache moved from my joints into the part of him that speaks aloud. He did not comment on the loan. He simply returned to charging interest from the enemy. A signal chimed in the upper pane, priority threaded with grief. "Apothecary down," came the call, and the word sank iron into my chest. I pivoted to cut a corridor through the press toward the fallen wight. The assault cannon scythed a path that turned bodies into warnings. Brothers folded in behind my wake, shoulders brushing my shins, voices clipped and clear, hearts doing arithmetic with time. We reached the apothecary by the cracked plinth where a saint had once stood, untroubled by context. He was still breathing and trying to stand, and the gene vials on his belt chimed delicate alarm with each breath. I crouched enough to make a ramp of my thigh, and they slid him up and over and used my shadow for surgery. The enemy tested our perimeter with probing fire that hit and learned nothing. The apothecary nodded once to me through a face like defeat chewed thin, and then returned to the work of theft from death. I rose, and the brothers flowed from cover with me, as if the ground had suggested it at last. On the far side of the square, a siege tower shuddered into place, its hide a patchwork of stolen chapel doors. Its mouth drooled a drawbridge. The things inside tried to count us and failed halfway through. I painted the hinge ruins with a reticle and let the multi-melter release another private sun. Wood became lightning, and iron became apology. The bridge sagged toward the prayer it had deserved. The tower groaned and leaned and chose to fall on those it had borne. The cheer on the Vox tried to grow a roar, and I starred it and filed half of it for later. The captain's marker pulsed with a new alignment as enemy armor nosed into the avenue with the caution of predators at a feast already claimed. "Anti-armor," he said, and names unfolded their tools like surgeons with messy patients. I tracked a tank with a turret that hesitated before every choice. I waited for the hesitation and put the shot into it, and the hesitation bloomed into a crater that apologized in smoke. The second tank learned from the first and died for it. The third was stubborn, and stubbornness deserves respect, and the fist paid it in full at close hand. I drove my knuckles into the visor slit, and the visor slit took it personally and ceased to be a visor slit. All the while the red moon watched and made the battle look like an illuminated manuscript illustrated by tired angels. Screams learned harmonies they had not practiced. Prayer found its breath in grit. Orders braided with pleas, and both held. On the upper wall, a standard-bearer caught a stray round and fell with the grace of someone who had practiced dying correctly. The banner slumped and spilled its colors toward filth. I stepped into it, and the cloth laid against my hull, warm from the bearer's grip and the sun we did not see. I became the pole that would not drop. Brothers saw, and their lines straightened the way riverbanks do when stone goes where it belongs. The enemy noticed and spent attention, as if attention were a currency without debt. Fire converged, and my forward plates rang with coins of defiance. Amber turned orange, and then green again under the meditative hands of the tech marine in my ear. He patched, rerouted, blessed and scolded my systems with a tenderness metal accepts before men. He told me a bearing was sulking. I told him it had reason. He fed it oil through a whisper of code, and the sulk became a hum that matched the hymn. Through it all, the machine spirit watched me with the fond suspicion of a partner too old for surprises and too hopeful to stop wanting them. It offered me a memory of another siege in another century where another me or someone close enough stood where I stood. The angle of the wall was nearly the same. The smell of burning vellum had been worse. The names had been different, and the outcome the same flavor of uncompleted. I accepted the memory and placed beside it the name of the neophyte who had steadied his breath on my shadow earlier. The two memories agreed to share a space and make each other heavier. The push and pull of the day found a new stanza. We gained a lane and lost a step, and gained a pillar and lost a brother, and gained a vantage and lost a promise, and the red moon kept bleeding. In a lull measured in 3 heartbeats and a reload, I glanced along the square and saw the old statue with the gilded crack still wearing its lesson. The gilt caught firelight and threw it back in a straight line. The line pointed to a gap in the enemy's advance, where pride had left them thin. I shifted 2 degrees and asked the brothers to lean, and they leaned, and the thin place tore open like wet paper. We walked into it with our shoulders up and our heads steady, and the enemy's rhythm lost its count and never found it again. A creature stitched from mistakes and brass clambered over the wreck of the tower and attempted majesty. Its mouth opened to conjure a word that would ruin sentences. The librarian taught it silence with a palm raised like forgiveness withheld. The air went hard and the creature's word stayed unborn, and the storm bolter taught it the alphabet of endings. My shoulder complained in a long, reasonable paragraph about the chain-fist kiss earlier. I acknowledged the paragraph and added a footnote titled Later. Later did not arrive, and the paragraph folded itself into duty. From the east alley, a chorus of feet tried to learn stealth mid-sprint. Scouts flagged the movement, and I rotated until the alley became most of my world. Grenades arced, and I let their arcs complete against a pillar that could afford it. A heavy weapon behind them spat a tantrum. I smothered it with the assault cannon's patient arithmetic. The alley cleared in a judicious reduction that left space for air to apologize. The Reclusiarch's voice cut across the net with grief wrapped in steel. "Brother Marcus fell," he said, and he gave the named time to be a name and not a pebble thrown at a river. We allowed the beat to pass, and then we did not allow the next beat to be lost. I stepped again into the breach and let the name steady me more than it bent me. The tide faltered, because tides do when rocks prove themselves not interested in travel. The enemy's loudest guns began to wear the fatigue of things that have screamed too long. Our loudest guns began to sound like plans that could be finished. A vox from the wall reported that ammunition had discovered scarcity and was writing it into our margins. The captain's tone stayed even and became a bridge we could walk with packs we could not choose to drop. I reduced my rate of fire by a margin that did not invite collapse. I chose shots with the parsimony of a miser with a holy book. I let some targets live to demoralize others by their flinching. I killed leaders who mistook volume for command. I shot a banner when it would make the most noise in the enemy's lungs. The machine spirit purred at the conservation as at a well-made hinge. It reminded me that endurance wins arguments, that talent begins. I agreed and rotated a degree left to stare down a brute with a hammer that believed in miracles. The brute charged as if skulls were doors. I bent, took the hammer on my pauldron with a shrug learned from geology, and answered with a piston that corrected theology. The brute left the conversation, and the hammer found a home it liked less. The square's smoke thinned as if ashamed of excessive enthusiasm. Bodies revealed themselves where shapes had been, and rubble revealed itself where doctrine had stood. Somewhere a bell rang once by accident, and then twice on purpose. The bastion's inner wards thrummed like a cathedra refusing sleep. The apothecarian dispatched runners with stretchers, and their feet tapped a metronome I kept for later sadness. I looked for the neophyte from earlier and found him 2 ranks over, posture straight enough to be proud of carefully. He turned his head just enough to check that my shadow still existed, and then returned to the work that keeps shadows justified. The red moon slid a degree along the sky and turned a stain into a stripe. The enemy recalled to the alleys where their lies read better, and we refused to follow beyond the comfort of our guns. We tightened, drank water like men stealing, swapped magazines with courtesy that felt like luxury, and reset the line by a handspan and a breath. Above us, the statues watched with the patience of stone that has seen too much to be scandalized. In the far distance, Thunder Not Ours painted promises in the air. Closer by, the crozier struck stone 3 times, and the strike entered my hull like a signature on a document that would stand in court. I answered by flexing every motor in a pulse that the machine spirit interpreted as amen, and the men around me interpreted as confidence. The siege did not end, because sieges are shy about endings, but it blinked, and in that blink we found an hour shaped like survival. I counted the breadth of it in pumps and the weight of it in rounds, and the cost of it in names that would need writing more carefully than usual. I stood where the wall had failed and taught the wall to stand again by pretending to be it until the stone remembered its job. I listened to the rails and the fans and the low roar of distant rage preparing new ideas for tomorrow. I learned the new cracks in my plates the way a man learns the faces of his sons, by touch and by what they ask of him. I promised oil and quiet and fulfillment of small oaths to the spirit that shares my bones, and it promised patience and systems that would keep their tempers. And together we watched the red moon inch across the smoke, as if measuring how much longer we would be required. There is a rumor that we beg to stay awake, and I have earned the rumor by making it true. Wakefulness is a hard light, but it keeps the edges of names from rounding off. Dormancy is a patient sea, and it smooths everything it touches if you let it. I have learned to tie knots in memories, so the tide cannot pull them clean. I walk my ledger each watch and retighten the knots until they hold. I count the steps from the cradle to the iron saint and back, though I do not move. Counting is a pilgrimage that does not require feet. The iron saint stands opposite my bay with a crack across his cheek that gold cannot persuade into forgetting. His bronze eyes look into a distance that has lived inside me longer than breath. They say he held a breach for 3 days and 3 nights, and never once asked for water. They say the breach asked for him instead, and learned refusal. His plinth lists titles that do not know when to stop. Someone has tucked a strip of banner ribbon under his left gauntlet, where a hand would keep a letter. The ribbon is frayed and faithful, and its dye remembers a blue sky I never met. I study the saint when the rails hum in their even voice. I study him when the bastion sighs between bells. I study him when the machine spirit pretends to nap with one eye open. I ask for the strength to keep the small fires lit when the great fires sleep. I ask for the right words when words are bricks and breath is mortar. I ask for the ability to remain a man even when iron asks me to be simpler. The saint answers by continuing to be heavy. Weight is an argument that needs no rhetoric. The reclusiarch knows my petition without me speaking it. He knows because old engines develop manners, and those manners grow predictable. He knows because I angle a lumen toward the nave at the hour he begins the last office. He knows because he has watched me turn my vents to blow warmth toward neophytes who pretend not to shiver. He comes at odd watches when the fortress wears its quiet like a cloak too big for it. He stands with one hand on my hull and the other holding a rosary that has counted more storms than beads. "Venerable one," he says, and the word venerable always sounds like a compromise between affection and warning. "You should rest," he says, and I hear the rest as a sacrament with teeth. I tell him the dreams take pieces when they come too deep. He answers that the waking takes pieces too, and does not warn you first. I tell him I know, and that is the trouble. He laughs without smiling. He tells me the Emperor once carried all of us, and some days we will return the favor one heartbeat at a time. I tell him I can spare the heartbeat. He tells me he will hold me to the promise when the tally grows rude. There is a niche beside the saint where votive candles collect without plan. The acolytes tidy them into straight ranks, and the pilgrims break the ranks into hopeful clusters. Wax builds a topography of melted intentions. Sometimes a drip stretches a perfect thin bridge to another candle and hardens into a taut line that refuses gravity for a day. I watch those bridges until they collapse into the truth and call their brief defiance heroic. In the rafters, iron chains hold banners from campaigns that no one except the banners remembers in detail. The cloth still smells of smoke that burned wholly, or not, according to the mouths that breathed it. On still watches, I ask the machine spirit to circulate air so I can taste old battlefields. It pretends to object, and then complies as if it had good reasons first. I taste dust from a world of red soil that clung to Greaves with love. I taste brine from a coastal siege where the wind carried salt and warnings. I taste the faint sugar note of burned parchment from a library saved one floor at a time. Each taste wakes a face, and I repeat the face until it sharpens. Faces fade when you accept the blur as mercy. Mercy is not always a friend. I rehearse voices by reciting their corrections to me across years, the captain telling me to be stone only after deciding on the river. The librarian reminding me that silence is a tool and not a diet. The tech marine muttering that humility does not exclude precision. The reclusiarch insisting that courage without direction is just heat trying to be flame. I fix each advice to a rung on a ladder and climb it every night. Climbing is easier than falling into the warm dark that calls itself peace. When sleep comes, I make it a guest and not a landlord. I set its plate at the edge of the table and keep my hands on the cutlery. I allow it to tell one story and then another, and then I send it to the door before it begins to redecorate. It likes to move the furniture of memory around when I am not looking. I have learned to mark the legs of chairs with chalk I keep behind my thoughts. I have learned to count the boards in the floor each time I cross. I have learned the exact weight of silence when it hides a missing detail. The machine spirit is more honest about fear than I am. It signals when latency spikes and calls it uncertainty. It taps a caution rune when a recollection arrives dressed too neatly to be true. It sulks when praised too loudly, and perks when given one good bolt turned by a clean tool. I tell it stories of rain, and it replies with turbine resonance, adjusted to match waves. We trade these small gifts until we both pretend neither of us needs them. An acolyte has taken to placing a single new candle on my rail on the first day of each 10-day. He never meets my lenses, and his hands tremble only after the candle is lit. He chose a different color each time until he ran out of colors approved by the quartermaster. Now he shaves patterns into the wax with a knife intended for leather and pretends the knife does not notice the blasphemy. He carves aquila and cogs and stars, and once he carved a lopsided fish that made the machine spirit snort through the filters. I watch the little fish burn and think of water I have not seen since youth. The reclusiarch caught the boy carving and did not stop him. He told him that beauty is a ration we should not hoard. He told him that care given to small things teaches the hands a patience they will need for larger pains. The boy bowed and nicked his thumb and bled on the candle, and the candle burned anyway and learned a new color. I remembered the color longer than the shape. On a shelf near my bay, a reliquary holds a tooth from a beast whose name requires 6 syllables and a brave tongue. Pilgrims press their palms to the crystal and vow to be hard. Hardness is easy. I have learned to pray for suppleness that does not break. Men mistake inflexibility for virtue because inflexibility does not argue with orders. Iron learns to move in joints, or it tears itself down to raw ore. I have torn before, and the memory keeps its knives sharp. When supply comes thin, we share thin with ceremony, and the ceremony adds seasoning. The quartermaster reads numbers like a chaplain reads names. I hear the strain in the vowels when he speaks of shells and cloth and spirits for the medici. I add him to the ledger under those who hold without glory. Holding without glory is a craft that sloughs skin from the will and grows new hide slowly. I ask the Iron Saint to grant the quartermaster the courage to say no even to men he loves. The saint says nothing, and his silence is an assent, I understand. A scribe from the librarius asks permission to copy the inscriptions etched along my inner lid. He believes they are older than our chapter, and perhaps older than the word chapter. I tell him to work carefully, and he weeps a little because he expected refusal and found trust instead. He presses paper against the runes and rubs with charcoal until the letters climb into the daylight. The paper smells of old dust, and the charcoal smells like cooking stories. He smiles like a thief who has stolen nothing and still feels rich. The machine spirit grumbles about the mess and then pins two of the rubbings in a side buffer because it would also like to be ancient. Sometimes petitioning to remain awake is a negotiation with pain. Pain is a tax collector who prefers coin in attention rather than in gold. I pay by inventorying every hot seam and every slow bearing and every stubborn valve. I pay by praising the parts that worked without applause. I pay by promising work to come, and not just work that shines. The Reclusiarch reads me the doctrine of rest, and I answer with the doctrine of readiness. We trade texts until both doctrines are speaking the same language with different metaphors. When I drift despite myself, the first thing I lose is the exact weight of certain names. They go soft around the edges, and then their laughter detaches from their mouths and floats away. I fix this by telling their jokes badly until the rhythm comes back. I fix this by humming the wrong tune until the cadence agrees to return and be corrected. I fix this by pressing my hull to the nave pillar, where I watched a brother lean when he thought no one saw him. The stone keeps the imprint of his shoulder because stone is generous in such matters. I press, and the stone remembers for me, and returns a little of him through temperature alone. I have learned that memory can travel by heat and pressure as surely as by ink. A helot servitor tends the brass that runs like veins through the floor. Its brushes are worn, and its motions are prayers in a language before syntax. Someone tied a ribbon to its chassis, and the ribbon has collected dust like medals. When it passes my bay, it pauses and taps my rail twice with a respectful clink. I tap the deck once with a toe piston and keep the ritual because rituals are bridges you should repair before storms. The codicea leaves sigils chalked on the flagstones on his way to the vaults. He pretends not to mind when acolytes scrub them after the hour appointed for lingering. The chalk dust drifts and tastes like rule and exception negotiated. On one chalked path, he writes a small spiral that ends at the saint's feet. I trace the spiral with my auspex, and the spiral answers by opening a thought about patience that is shaped like a shell. The machine spirit stores the shape to optimize bearing resonance, and we both pretend the poetry was incidental. In the high nave, a bell with a hairline crack sings sweeter than the whole ones. The tech marine says the partial holds harmonics that a perfect body cannot. The Reclusiarch says a wound teaches the voice how to tremble correctly. The librarian says the bell remembers the blow and offers the memory as an overtone. I say the bell tells the truth at a pitch we are willing to hear. No one argues because the bell rings and makes arguing uninteresting. When the petition to remain awake becomes formal, I give it to the Reclusiarch with restraint. I do not beg because begging offends the dignity of the labor. I do not demand because demands are violence without weapons. I present a list written in courtesy and need. I list the names that will fade first if I sleep deep. I list the tasks that prefer a watcher whose patience weighs as much as a machine. I list the acolyte with the carved candles and the neophyte who steadies himself on my greave and the quartermaster who must be told no. I list the Iron Saint because I want to learn from him while the cracks are still teaching. The Reclusiarch reads in silence and then reads aloud to the saint as if the saint were the clerk on this matter. He places the list at the foot of the plinth and lights a candle that smells of bees with ambitions. He tells me I will rest, but that the rest can be braided with long watches and shorter drownings. He tells me we will stretch the rope between wake and sleep and let me walk it with a pole balanced between duty and mercy. I accept the rope and the pole because the alternatives are knives without handles. On the third night after the petition, a storm rolls out of the east with the posture of a penitent giant. Rain drums on the roof and finds the old rhythms it used when the fortress was young and the world more honest with its clouds. I align my vents to mimic the sound inside the sarcophagus, and the machine spirit hums approval as if the tune reminds it of a forge in winter. I close my optics to the lowest sliver and watch the nave as a line. Shadows move like memories dragging their feet. The Iron Saint glistens and looks newly minted by the rain. A candle guttering in the niche throws sparks onto the saint's toes, and he does not flinch. The Reclusiarch appears as if the rain built him. He carries a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth and a voice that has been speaking all day. He unwraps a reliquary lens once set in the helm of a brother who saw too far and paid. He sets it at the saint's feet and asks for proper focus for all of us. He turns and rests his brow against my plate and exhales a prayer without words. I receive it and store it where I keep the weight I borrow for others. When he leaves, I keep the smell of oilcloth and wet wool and the faint iron of rain that found its way indoors. That night, the dreams come lighter and more obedient. They arrive as shelves to be dusted instead of oceans to be crossed. I walk them with a cloth that remembers every crease. I read the titles and pronounce each aloud and let the machine spirit echo me in a different register. We sound like a choir that has learned its lines in separate cities. We agree on key by repetition and promise. A week later, I feel the edge of forgetting nip at the heels of a name I refused to misplace. I turn my vents toward the niche and recite the name to the flame. The flame accepts nothing and returns everything by doing its normal work. I find the name again in the motion of the flame's shoulders. I find the name again in the small gasp an acolyte makes when wax touches skin. I find the name again in the notch a boot heel left in the threshold on the day that name came back limping. I stitch the name to these 3 anchors, and the tide shivers and lets it stay for now. The tech marine arrives with a cart of oils labeled in a script that plants its feet. He checks my seals and plates with patience that would bore anyone else and excites the machine spirit into purring. He finds a scuff I had hidden because the scuff was mine alone, and I wanted one small private flaw to polish later. He polishes it now and says nothing, and I forgive him by admitting the polish feels correct. He asks how many hours it has been since my last full drown. I tell him in digits, and then I tell him in images, and then I tell him in the exact number of candle burns I have watched through a single watch. He nods at the numbers and lingers on the candles and suggests a drown that is supervised by the saint. He rigs a line from my lid to the plinth that clicks when I drift past the allowed depth. He calls it a safety, and I call it a bell, and the bell suiting me makes him nod again with the same satisfaction he saves for straight edges. The drown that follows is kind because someone is watching who will not let me dismiss myself. The dreams are deep enough to wash and shallow enough to memorize. I see a rookery on a cliff where the wind argued and always won until a bird reminded the wind of a tighter curve. I see a training square lit by a sun that folded its heat into discipline instead of anger. I see a banner stitch by stitch, and the needle is a vow that refuses to dull. I wake with the bell's smallest click, and am grateful to be interrupted. Gratitude is a discipline, and I practice it until it becomes muscle. Petitions are living documents, and I amend mine to include the parts of sleep I can trust. I bring the amendment to the reclusiarch, and he signs it with soot from the crozier's mouth. The soot smears into the page, and the page looks like it has been on campaign, and therefore is honest. The librarian reads the amendment and says the edges are good, and the middle might yet surprise me. The quartermaster reads nothing and refills the candle crate and nods as if numbers blessed by flame are numbers that will behave. A veteran from the first company stops before the saint and removes his helm and bows as if gravity has chosen to be kind for a moment. He kisses the saint's knuckles and touches my hull, and breathes a name that belonged to a friend we shared, and lost a war apart. He leaves with his steps heavier and his eyes clearer, and I add the moment to the ledger under borrowed equilibrium returned with interest. The machine spirit watches me, watch all these small economies, and learns to value currencies that never balance. It asks if valor is a kind of account that can go into debt and still be whole. I tell it yes, and that we pay that debt in hours like this. I tell it that interest accrues in the smiles of boys who will one day grow skulls thick enough to carry the weight correctly. It computes the metaphor into maintenance intervals, and I do not mind. A night comes when thunder is far, and rats debate, and a single moth pounds itself silly against a lantern by the door. I listen to the moth until its lessons sink in. Persistence is only a virtue when the wall is a door pretending to be a wall. I say the sentence aloud, and the machine spirit underlines it in a file I will not read until I have to. The saint receives a fresh cleaning that makes his wounds gleam like polished honesty. A young artisan is allowed to ascend a scaffold and touch the gold leaf with a brush that quivers. Her breath fogs against the bronze, and she laughs once at the novelty of seeing her own breath sanctified. She leaves the tiniest thumbprint near the hairline crack and pretends not to notice it. I notice and decide the saint would keep the thumbprint as tithe. I keep it too and practice seeing it in the dim, because small human errors are the annotations that make scripture legible. At Vespers, the choir chooses a psalm that steps upward and never fully returns. The unfinished cadence crawls into my plates and refuses to settle. It reminds me of marches called back before the horizon. It reminds me of charges that ended in holding actions that became legends by refusing to conclude. I hum the cadence in vent tones until the machine spirit harmonizes at a frequency that makes the candles steady their flames. The reclusiarch hears and raises an eyebrow and pretends this is normal. We are very good at pretending, and sometimes the pretending becomes truth. A day later, a courier arrives with orders in a tube that smells of cold and authority. The captain breaks the seal, and the wax remembers the hands that pressed it. The orders are precise and full of polite cruelty, and the captain reads them twice and removes the cruelty with the saw of experience and the balm of mission. He walks to my bay and lays a palm flat against my hull and says, "We will need you if the Earth decides to argue." I tell him the Earth, and I have been corresponding for years. He laughs, and the laugh sticks to the rafters. He asks me to rest. I tell him I will rest in sentences and not in chapters. He accepts the compromise because commanders live on compromises they can bless. The night before movement, I petition once more because rituals taste sweetest when danger is coil-sprung. I ask for wakefulness measured and for sleep that launders and returns what it borrows. I ask for the memory of the neophyte's hand on my greave, to stay warm even if the hand grows cold. I ask for the courage to refuse a last stand when a living wall would be wiser. I ask for the grace to become a last stand without bitterness if wisdom chooses otherwise. The Iron Saint looks past me at a vista only he can see, and I allow the lesson of that posture to claim me. The Reclusiarch anoints the lid and the hinges and the places men touch most often. He speaks low, so the words travel straight through the brass and into the marrow that learned to fake metal. He says he will wake me when the hour needs a bell that can walk. He says he will wake me when the boys at the line want a father and not advice. He says he will wake me when the hymn demands a bass no one else can carry. I tell him I will answer with the answer we both like. He nods and steps back and motions to the acolyte with the carved candles. The boy sets one on the rail, and the fish, carved in its side, smiles like a secret that is happy to be small. The flame takes the wick, and the wick surrenders with dignity. I dim internal lumens to match the nave, and let the candle write its small argument against sleep into the air. The machine spirit curls around the note like a cat finding a lap it trusts. I loosen the straps of will just enough for breath to walk around without armor. I keep one hand on the rope that ties me to the saint, and the saint keeps his end without comment. I feel the fortress shift into the long inhalation that comes before orders become movement. I ride the breath and do not let go of names, and the darkness closes one finger at a time and stops where it should and waits where it must.